They say some towns are cursed, not by witches or spirits, but by the memories they refuse to forget. In Alabama's forgotten countryside, where the fog clings to the trees and old houses whisper through the wind, there stood a family whose name locals dare not speak aloud after dark. A family whose daughters disappeared one by one, all on the same night of their 16th birthday. Tonight we go back to the year 1850 to uncover the chilling mystery that still haunts the soil of Ellison Hollow. In the heart of Alabama's countryside, far from the bustling towns and the safety of watchful eyes, stood the Ellison estate, a grand but unsettling sight that dominated the horizon like a relic of something both magnificent and cursed. Built in the early 1800s, it was said to be one of the most beautiful plantations in the region, surrounded by sprawling oak trees draped in Spanish moss and fields that shimmered gold under the sun. Yet beneath its beauty, the air always carried a strange heaviness, an almost imperceptible tension that made even the bravest travelers hurry past its gates before sunset. The Ellison family had once been a symbol of pride, wealth, and grace in Montgomery County, but with time, whispers began to curl through the air like smoke, whispers of strange happenings that no one dared to repeat too loudly. The patriarch, Samuel Ellison, was a man of ambition and mystery. He had inherited the estate from his father, who had carved his fortune through cotton and tobacco, and Samuel expanded it tenfold. But the land upon which the estate was built had a past, one soaked in sorrow. Locals spoke of a native burial ground unearthed during the estate's construction, of bones that were disturbed and warnings ignored. When the first Ellison house burned down under inexplicable circumstances in 1829, Samuel rebuilt it on the same land, declaring that no curse or superstition could touch his family. Yet from that moment forward, strange misfortunes began to shadow every corner of their lives. The Ellison estate became known not just for its grandeur, but for the chilling silence that seemed to hang over it after dusk. Servants refused to stay past dark, claiming to hear footsteps pacing through empty halls, the rustling of skirts in rooms no one occupied, and soft crying echoing through the nursery. The family dismissed these tales as the talk of frightened workers, but unease grew when Samuel's wife, Margaret, began keeping candles lit in every window through the night, muttering prayers under her breath. The once lively household became a place of shadows and secrets, where laughter was replaced by the sound of creaking floors and the whispers of the wind weaving through broken shutters. Then came the births of the Ellison daughters, 6 in total, each one born under strange and fearful circumstances. The midwives claimed that every time a daughter was delivered, the weather outside turned violent. One birth was marked by a thunderstorm so fierce it split a tree in half near the barn. Another, by an unseasonal frost that killed half the crops overnight. With every new child, the locals grew more convinced that the Ellisons were paying for something buried deep within their bloodline. Yet, despite the unease that surrounded them, the girls grew up radiant, graceful, and hauntingly identical in their delicate features and pale eyes. They were often seen walking together through the fields, their white dresses glowing under the sun like ghostly apparitions long before any tragedy struck. As the years passed, rumors of the family's curse deepened. It was said that Samuel had once made a pact, a desperate promise made in the darkest hours of his life, when his fortune teetered on ruin and his wife lay deathly ill. No one knew to whom he made that promise, only that his luck changed overnight. The crops flourished again, the estate doubled in size, and Margaret miraculously recovered. But as the first of his daughters approached her 16th birthday, the household fell under a strange spell of dread. Doors were locked, windows barred, servants sent away, and yet, on the stroke of midnight, the girl was gone. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, no footprints leading away. Only her room left in eerie stillness, her bed unmade, and a faint scent of lilac hanging in the air. When it happened again 2 years later with the second daughter, panic began to infect the family like a disease. Samuel searched the fields for days, his hands torn and bloody from digging through the earth, as if he believed something beneath the soil had taken her. The town offered prayers but kept their distance, afraid to bring the misfortune upon themselves. People said they saw Samuel talking to no one in the orchard at night, begging unseen forces for forgiveness. His wife, pale and silent, stopped leaving her room altogether, and the once vibrant estate began to decay before the town's eyes. Paint peeled from the walls, The gardens grew wild, and the grand house that once welcomed guests now stood as a monument to fear and unanswered questions. By the time the third and fourth daughters vanished, the Ellison name had become a whispered curse in Alabama. Farmers refused to till the nearby land. Travelers avoided the roads that passed near the estate, and those who did claimed to see candlelight flickering through the windows long after the family had supposedly gone to sleep. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing in the sorrow of its inhabitants and feeding on their despair. The air around the estate grew heavier, and birds no longer nested in the trees that lined its gates. Even the sound of the river nearby seemed to change, its steady murmur replaced by something that resembled a sigh. The Ellison family tried everything to break what they believed was haunting them. Priests came and went, blessing the rooms, sprinkling holy water on the grounds, and urging Samuel to abandon the property. He refused, claiming that the land was his inheritance, his legacy, and that no phantom could drive him from it. But with each passing year, the same pattern returned. A 16th birthday, a locked room, a missing girl, and the same unbearable silence left behind. It became clear to the few who still spoke of the Ellisons that the curse was not just tied to the land, it was bound to the blood of the family itself, woven into their lineage by a secret that none of them dared to confess. Even now, old records and faded letters speak of the Ellison estate as a place where light seldom lingered, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred long before the last daughter vanished. The soil, it is said, remembers the footsteps of those who lived there, and the wind still carries the faint sound of a young girl's laughter that fades into crying as dusk falls across the Alabama fields. The pattern began with the first disappearance, subtle at first but too precise to ignore once it began to repeat itself. Each Ellison daughter, 6 in total, vanished on the night of her 16th birthday, leaving behind no trace of struggle, no sound of distress, and no explanation that could satisfy even the most rational minds. At first it seemed like cruel coincidence, a tragedy too painful for reason. But as the years passed, and each daughter reached that cursed age, it became impossible to deny that something far darker was at work within the walls of the Ellison estate. The pattern was unmistakable, and every person in the nearby town who whispered about it knew that the Ellison name had become bound to something unnatural. The first daughter, Clara, was said to have been a quiet and gentle child, fond of painting, and often found sitting by her window long after the others had gone to sleep. On the eve of her 16th birthday, the house had been filled with the faint hum of celebration, yet there was tension beneath it, a silent fear that neither parent dared to speak aloud. Samuel Ellison had insisted on keeping the house guarded, locking every door and shuttering every window before nightfall. Margaret, her mother, stayed beside her room, praying softly as the clock in the hallway ticked toward midnight. But when the morning came, Clara's room was empty. The window was closed, the lock unbroken, the candle still burning on her bedside table, but her bed was cold. All that remained was her birthday dress, folded neatly on the chair, and the faint smell of lilac lingering in the air. No one could explain it. Servants were questioned, the grounds were searched, and dogs were brought to trace her scent, but they only circled the estate, whining and refusing to enter the orchard. The disappearance was marked as a tragedy, a mystery too painful for words, and for a time, the Ellisons tried to bury it beneath their grief. But 2 years later, when their second daughter, Lillian, turned 16, the same dread returned to the household. Margaret begged Samuel to send her away, to let her stay with family in Mobile until her birthday passed, but he refused. He claimed that running would only feed whatever darkness haunted them, that facing it was the only way to end it. On the night of Lillian's birthday, the house was silent, the servants dismissed, and every candle extinguished except for the one that burned in her room. At midnight, Samuel stood outside her door, his hand on the lock, listening to her breathing within. But just as the clock struck 12, that breathing stopped. When he opened the door, she was gone, her bed untouched, the candle still flickering weakly, and the same haunting scent of lilac filling the air. By then, the pattern had begun to reveal itself, and fear took root not only within the Ellison family but across the entire county. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it a curse that demanded a daughter every 2 years. Rumors spread that Samuel had made a pact with something unholy, that his wealth and prosperity had been purchased at the cost of his children's lives. The whispers grew louder when he began to age rapidly, his hair whitening before his time, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Margaret retreated into silence, her once vibrant laughter now replaced by the faint sound of her praying through the walls. She lit candles for her daughters each night, never allowing them to burn out, as though the light could somehow guide the missing girls back home. The third daughter, Eliza, tried to defy the pattern. She was strong-willed and skeptical, refusing to believe in curses or spirits. When her 16th birthday approached, she laughed at the stories, claiming she would prove that fear itself was the family's downfall. But as the day neared, even her defiance began to fade. She woke from dreams of shadows standing by her window, of whispers calling her name from the orchard. Samuel ordered guards to patrol the grounds, but by morning, she too was gone. Her door had remained locked from the inside, her window sealed, and yet her room was empty except for her journal, open to a final, unfinished sentence that no one could read. The ink smeared as though written in a trembling hand. With each disappearance, the pattern became more deliberate, more cruel, as though the entity or curse that plagued the family was following a ritual that could not be broken. The townspeople began to avoid the Ellison estate entirely, crossing themselves when they passed the road that led to it. Children were warned not to speak the family's name, and even the church refused to ring its bells when another daughter vanished. By the time the fourth and fifth girls reached their 16th birthdays, the Ellisons were isolated completely. Servants quit, relatives refused to visit, and Samuel, desperate and unraveling, spent nights pacing through the halls, muttering about debts and promises. He was seen more than once in the orchard, digging into the soil as though searching for something buried long ago. Some claimed they saw him speaking to a figure no one else could see, a woman in white, her face hidden beneath a veil, standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the reach of the lantern light. The sixth daughter, Amelia, was said to be the most like her mother, kind, quiet, and fearful of the estate's secrets. When her 16th birthday drew near, she begged to be sent away, but Samuel could not bear the thought of losing his last child, even temporarily. He swore he would protect her, that he would not let the curse claim another. On that final night, he locked himself in her room, holding her hand, as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The candles flickered, the wind rattled the shutters, and for a brief moment, it seemed that dawn might finally come without tragedy. But as the final chime of midnight echoed through the hall, the room went cold. The candles were snuffed out, the air filled once more with the scent of lilac, and when the servants forced the door open the next morning, Samuel lay alone on the floor, his hair turned completely white, his hand reaching toward the empty bed. From that night on, the Ellison estate was abandoned, left to rot under the weight of its secrets. No one dared to enter, and those who passed by swore they could hear faint music, drifting from the upper rooms on nights when the moon was full, as though unseen hands still celebrated a birthday that would never end. The pattern of the disappearances became legend, a dark tale told around fires and whispered in schoolyards, a reminder that some promises are not easily broken, and that some bloodlines carry burdens that time itself refuses to forget. As the years passed and the Ellison family vanished from sight, the small Alabama town that once surrounded them grew quiet in its fear. What had begun as whispered rumors after the first disappearance soon hardened into a silence that no one dared to break. The Ellison estate stood on its hill like a monument to dread, its windows dark, its fields unkept, its iron gates rusting beneath layers of dust and ivy. Travelers spoke of it in low voices as they passed, refusing to look too long at its silhouette against the moonlight. For the people who lived nearby, the name Ellison became a thing to be avoided entirely, as if the very mention of it might awaken whatever force had taken hold of that family. The town was gripped by an unspoken rule. Do not go near the estate, do not ask questions, and never, under any circumstance, speak the daughters' names aloud. It began with the servants, the few who had remained after the third disappearance. They told stories of hearing laughter in the hallways long after the house had been emptied, of candlelight flickering in rooms where no flame was lit, and of faint music drifting through the night, like the echo of a forgotten celebration. When the townsfolk came to investigate, they found nothing, yet they could not ignore the feeling that the air near the estate was different, heavy, and watching. The local preacher warned his congregation to stay away, calling the place a gate between worlds. But no sermon or prayer could ease the chill that came over anyone who strayed too close. The fear spread beyond the Ellison property, seeping into every corner of the community. Farmers refused to work the land nearest to the estate, claiming their livestock would grow restless when led too close to the boundary. Horses would buck and whinny without cause. Dogs would bark and then fall silent, staring into the distance as if seeing something invisible. Some nights, smoke was seen rising from the estate chimney, though everyone knew the house had been deserted. Others swore they saw a flicker of light moving through the orchard, like a lantern carried by unseen hands. A few brave souls who dared to enter the grounds never stayed long. They returned pale, trembling, speaking of strange noises, the soft sound of girls singing somewhere deep within the house and the sharp creak of doors opening and closing by themselves. None ever returned a second time. The older generation told the younger ones that the Ellison curse was not just a family's burden, it was a sickness that spread through memory. They said the more one spoke of it, the closer one came to feeling its reach. By the 1870s, no one in the nearby towns would buy or rent land within sight of the estate. It was said that one family who tried to rebuild near the property in hopes of farming the abandoned fields fled after their daughter began waking each night, claiming to see 6 pale faces watching her through the window. Even after the estate fell into ruin, the fear persisted, passing from parents to children like a warning written into their blood. There were always those who sought to prove the legends false. In the 1890s, a group of young men from a nearby town made a dare of it, spending the night inside the old Ellison house to prove there was nothing to fear. Only 2 returned. They refused to speak of what had happened, though one was found days later wandering near the river, his clothes soaked and his eyes empty of recognition. The other never spoke again, his hair turning white within a week. Locals said that before the men entered, the night had been still. But as soon as they crossed the threshold, the wind rose from nowhere, bending the trees as if the earth itself was shuddering. Those who lived near enough to hear said the old house groaned like something alive, and just before midnight, the faint sound of girls' laughter echoed across the fields before vanishing into silence. For decades, the house remained untouched. The town grew outward in every direction except toward the Ellison land, as though invisible hands were keeping it isolated. Children were told stories to keep them from wandering too far. Stories of the Ellison daughters still trapped between worlds, forever 16, wandering the halls, waiting for another to join them. Some claimed to see figures in the upper windows, shadows that looked like girls in long dresses, standing perfectly still, staring out at the road. On certain nights when the moon was low and the fog thick, travelers swore they could see those figures move, turning their heads slowly to follow anyone who passed. There were countless stories of strange happenings around the area, each one more haunting than the last. Mail carriers who took the old route past the Ellison property said they would find letters scattered along the road, each envelope blank except for a faint scent of lilac. Hunters claimed to hear voices whispering their names from the woods, only to find no one there. And there were those who said they saw a woman in white walking along the riverbank that bordered the Ellison fields, her face obscured by a veil, her footsteps leaving no trace in the mud. She would disappear whenever anyone tried to approach, fading into the mist like smoke. Even the town records grew strange around the Ellison name. Pages went missing, documents were misfiled, and accounts of the family's history became fragmented and unreliable. Some said this was intentional, that the town leaders had destroyed everything tied to the Ellisons to rid themselves of the curse. Others believed it was something else entirely, that whatever haunted the estate reached into memory itself, erasing details and leaving only the lingering sense of dread. What little history remained was passed down through oral accounts, each retelling adding to the legend, each detail painting the Ellisons as a family bound by something that refused to die. The silence surrounding the estate became part of its power. People learned to avert their gaze when passing its overgrown gates, to whisper prayers under their breath without even realizing why. The fear was no longer just of ghosts, but of the story itself, of what might happen if it were remembered too clearly. The Ellison estate stood untouched for more than half a century, its walls crumbling, its roof sagging, and yet no one dared to tear it down. The town grew older, the people changed, but the land remained the same, a scar on the countryside that no amount of time could heal. Even as new generations came and went, the fear remained, lingering like the faint scent of lilac carried on the wind, reminding all who lived nearby that some stories are not meant to be forgotten, and some silences are not born from peace, but from terror too deep to name. Samuel Ellison had once been a man admired across Montgomery County, a symbol of prosperity and determination, someone who had built his name with his own hands and expanded the family's legacy through willpower and faith. But after the disappearances began, the proud, composed patriarch began to unravel before the eyes of those who still dared to look his way. The tragedy of losing one daughter could shatter any man, but for Samuel, it was as if the universe itself had singled him out for punishment. He aged decades within a few years, his strong shoulders bent beneath the weight of guilt, his voice hollow, his once steady hands trembling as if every heartbeat carried a memory he could not bear to keep. The townsfolk who once spoke his name with respect now whispered it with fear, saying that Samuel Ellison had made a deal with something beyond this world, a promise that demanded payment he could no longer afford. After the second disappearance, Samuel began wandering the fields at night, barefoot, muttering to himself. Servants would find him hours later, kneeling in the dirt, his fingers digging into the soil until his nails bled, whispering words no one could understand. He stopped attending church, claiming the prayers did nothing, that God had turned his face from him. His wife, Margaret, tried to hold on to her faith, but even she began to sense something dark coiling around her husband, something that fed on his desperation. He would sit for hours in his study staring at old ledgers, tracing names and dates with his shaking hand, as though searching for a secret hidden in the ink. It was said that he kept a locked journal that no one else was allowed to see, one filled with ramblings, symbols, and sketches of strange shapes that looked like circles crossed with lines and markings not found in any scripture. There were nights when the house came alive with his madness. The servants would wake to his shouting, his voice echoing down the halls as he argued with no one, begging for mercy, demanding to know what more was required of him. Some claimed they heard another voice answering him, a woman's voice, soft and cold, carried through the corridors like a song. When asked, Samuel would say nothing, his eyes distant, his mind slipping further each day into the grip of something that had no name. The fields that had once thrived under his care grew barren, the crops turning grey at their roots, and the livestock refused to go near the orchard where he often wandered. It was during one of those nights that a servant saw him standing at the edge of the orchard speaking to what appeared to be a figure cloaked in white. The moonlight revealed only the faint outline of a woman, her head tilted slightly as if listening. The servant swore she saw Samuel reach out to her, his lips moving, his shoulders shaking as he fell to his knees. When morning came, he claimed he had been praying, though his eyes told another story. Eyes sunken deep into his skull, surrounded by dark circles, and filled with a terror that no prayer could erase. He stopped speaking of salvation altogether after that, replacing his prayers with rituals of his own making. Candles burned through the night in every window, symbols were carved into the doorframes, and mirrors were covered with sheets to keep something from looking back. The house itself began to change under his madness. Doors would slam without wind, and rooms would grow unbearably cold, even in the heart of summer. Margaret's health declined rapidly, as though the darkness that consumed her husband had reached for her as well. She became a ghost of herself, her face pale, her voice no more than a whisper. She would often sit by the piano in the parlor, playing the same tune over and over until the notes grew slower and softer, fading into silence as her hands trembled. It was said she spoke to her daughters late into the night, their names whispered into the air as though she believed they were still within those walls, listening. Samuel could no longer bear to be in the same room when she did, for every note seemed to remind him of what he had lost and what he had brought upon them. His desperation reached its peak after the fifth disappearance. He barricaded himself in the cellar for days, refusing food or light. When he emerged, he carried with him an old box wrapped in cloth, which he refused to let anyone touch. Some said it contained letters written by the first Ellison patriarch, detailing the family's first deal with whatever spirit had claimed them. Others said it was filled with relics, bones, trinkets, and fragments of something buried long before the house was built. Samuel began visiting the church again, not to pray, but to demand answers. He accused the preacher of hypocrisy, saying the church had turned a blind eye to evil festering beneath its own soil. He claimed the curse had not begun with him, that it was older than the land itself, older even than the people who had built the town. His words frightened everyone, for he spoke with such conviction that even the preacher refused to meet his gaze. Soon, Samuel stopped leaving the estate altogether. He wandered its halls like a restless spirit, lighting candles at each daughter's door, whispering apologies that grew fainter each night. The servants who remained said he often spoke of an agreement, of a woman who came to him in his youth, offering fortune in exchange for something he thought he could control. He had been foolish, he said, believing he could outwit the thing that had given him everything he desired. Now, he claimed, it had come to collect its due. He could feel it in the air, see it in the shadows that lengthened too quickly, hear it in the faint tapping on his window at night that grew louder each time one of his daughter's birthdays approached. In his final years, Samuel was no longer the man the town had once known. He grew reclusive and frail, his mind slipping further into a haze of guilt and fear. He spoke often of seeing his daughters in dreams, standing in a field of white lilies, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving as though they were trying to speak but no sound came out. He would wake in tears, calling their names, and rush to their rooms only to find them as empty and cold as ever. The servants abandoned him one by one until only a single caretaker remained, a man who would later claim that on Samuel's last night alive, the entire house shook with a sudden gust of wind. The candles went out all at once, and a woman's voice whispered his name through the halls. The caretaker found him in the study at dawn, seated in his chair, his head bowed, a faint smile on his lips, and his hand clutching a withered white flower that smelled of lilac. Decades after the final Ellison vanished, the estate stood abandoned, its windows shattered, and its halls filled with the slow decay of time. The town grew older, generations passed, and yet no one dared to claim the land that once symbolized wealth and legacy. For years, the house was nothing more than a silhouette against the gray Alabama sky, a place children whispered about but never approached, a place travelers hurried past even in daylight. But when the 20th century arrived and progress began to push against the forgotten corners of the South, the old Ellison property once again drew attention. Developers saw opportunity in the vast, unused land, believing that whatever haunted the family's past was nothing more than myth. They decided to demolish what remained of the house to make way for new farmland and construction. What they found beneath the estate, however, would reignite the fear that had lain dormant for more than 50 years. The demolition began in the spring, when the air was heavy with humidity and the scent of wildflowers hung thick across the field. The workers were uneasy from the beginning. The ground seemed unusually soft near the old house, the air strangely still. Tools broke more often than they should have, and machinery stalled without cause. One man claimed to hear a low humming sound beneath the soil, like a faint vibration that seemed to move whenever he shifted position. Another said he saw movement in the windows of the collapsing house, a flicker of white fabric disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Most brushed it off as nerves, the product of old stories lingering in their minds. But unease grew as they reached the foundation, where the structure resisted every attempt to tear it down, as though something deep beneath the earth refused to be disturbed. On the third day, when they finally broke through the main flooring, one of the workers struck something hard beneath the boards. At first, they believed it was stone, but as the debris cleared, they discovered an entrance, a narrow set of stairs leading down into darkness. There had been no record of a basement or cellar in any of the original blueprints. The entrance had been sealed with heavy planks nailed from above, and the wood showed signs of having been burned around the edges, as though someone had tried to close it forever. Curiosity got the better of them, and despite their hesitation, two men descended into the blackness with lanterns. The air below was thick and unmoving, carrying a damp, sweet scent that none of them could quite identify. What they found at the bottom of the steps froze them in place. The cellar was small, its walls made of rough stone, but it was what those walls held that silenced every man who stood there. Carved deep into the stone were 6 names: Clara, Lillian, Eliza, Nora, Mary, and Amelia, each one etched with precision, each one followed by a date. The first 5 names matched the years the daughters had disappeared. The 6th name, Amelia, bore no date, and beneath it, space had been left for another. In the center of the floor was a ring of salt, long disturbed, and within it lay fragments of what looked like old candles melted into the dirt. In one corner sat a small wooden box, rotted with age but still faintly marked with the Ellison family crest. When they opened it, the scent of lilac filled the room so suddenly and so strongly that several of the men staggered back, covering their mouths. Inside the box were objects wrapped in decaying cloth: locks of hair, a ribbon, a small porcelain doll, and a folded piece of paper that had long since yellowed. Only a few words could still be read, scrawled in a desperate hand: "Debt paid, not forgiven." The men fled the cellar after that, refusing to continue the work. The foreman, shaken but determined to complete the project, ordered the site cleared the next morning. By dawn, several workers had refused to return, claiming to have heard crying through the night coming from beneath the ground. Those who stayed reported that the earth seemed to breathe, that the wind near the estate carried whispers that faded as soon as they tried to listen. The demolition was eventually completed and the land was leveled, but nothing new would grow where the house once stood. Crops withered quickly, machinery broke down, and the scent of lilac continued to linger even months later, strongest during the last week of May, the same week Amelia Ellison had vanished. The new owner of the property, frustrated by his constant losses, sold the land for almost nothing, and it sat untouched once more, returning to its wild state, as if the earth itself rejected human hands. The story of what the workers found spread quickly, retold in taverns, and whispered among the older families of the region. Some said the cellar had been a shrine, a place where Samuel Ellison had tried to contain the curse, perhaps to appease whatever force demanded his daughters. Others believed it had been built by someone else entirely, a place meant not for worship, but for imprisonment. In the years that followed, explorers and ghost hunters came, drawn by the legend. None stayed long. They spoke of cold air rising from the ground even in the middle of summer, of faint singing heard through the soil, and of lights flickering in the distance where the house once stood. A few claimed to have uncovered more carvings near the site, markings that resembled circles and symbols hidden under layers of moss and dirt. Some took photographs, though most of those pictures developed blank, as if the camera had failed to capture what was truly there. One historian who visited in the 1950s claimed to have found references in old church records to a woman named Eleanor Vale, a healer and midwife who was accused of witchcraft in 1803 and disappeared without trial. Her last known location had been the very same land that became the Ellison property. It was whispered that Samuel's ancestor had struck a bargain with her to bless the land with prosperity, unaware that such blessings often come at a terrible cost. Though the estate no longer stands, those who live near the area still claim that when the wind moves through the trees on quiet nights, it carries the faint sound of laughter. Young girls, distant and hollow, fading into sobs that seem to come from beneath the ground. Locals leave flowers along the edge of the property every spring, mostly white lilies and lilacs, though none will admit to doing it. No one builds there, no one farms there, and even the birds avoid nesting in the nearby trees. Travelers who pass through late at night often say they see lantern light moving through the fields, as if someone is walking the land, searching for something that was never returned. Others tell of a figure in white appearing near the old well, her veil trailing behind her as she moves silently through the mist, pausing to look toward the road before vanishing again into the tall grass. The legend of the Ellison family has become one of those stories that refuses to die, buried deep within Alabama's history like a root that keeps growing no matter how many times it is cut. Old maps still mark the area where the estate once stood, but locals avoid pointing it out. They say it's not the land that's cursed, but the memory itself, as if remembering gives the story life again. And though generations have passed, and the world around it has changed, that patch of earth remains untouched, held in the same eerie stillness it has known since the night the last Ellison girl vanished, when the house went silent and the wind carried the scent of lilac across the fields once more.